Delegation, formal or otherwise, is there to meet the president. The New York governor, George Pataki, who has been in the city rather than the state capitol since this all began. And we certainly expect we'll see New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani as well making the walk. The FEMA director has been in town, a longtime friend of the president's, Joe Alba, and I believe in the Poole report, David Gregory said that a number of the people on the president's plane were wearing FEMA jackets. Judy can join us now. Judy?
Aaron, as we're watching these pictures of the president in New York, we can tell our viewers that our White House correspondent John King has learned that the president has declared a state of national emergency today, a legal requirement, we are told, tied to the decision to authorize the Pentagon to call up National Guard and military reservists in the wake of what happened on Tuesday. John King reporting the declaration cites the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and notes, quote, the continuing and immediate threat of further attacks on the United States, end quote. Now, of course, that's a reference to what investigative authorities are telling our reporters, that it is not wrong to assume that there still are people in the United States with plans to do further great harm to this country. The president also issued an executive order, we're told, John King learning, authorizing the Pentagon to issue that call up to Guard members and reservists, and he has sent a letter to Congress notifying them of all of these decisions. Again, this reporting coming from our White House correspondent John King. Aaron?
I believe I saw this correctly. The president did not get into the usual limousine. He got in to one of those large SUVs that generally hold the Secret Service agents in the motorcade. I'm almost certain that's what I saw. It would one more small sign, but a sign nevertheless that the security is quite tight. It looked also to us that a number of agents were in that SUV. President making his way from the west side, from the Hudson River across now, and it's not very far, to the site, and there's a look at the site. It is still smoldering all these many hours later, and even despite the rain that has created a somewhat dangerous situation, slippery, muddy. It has certainly been a dreadfully uncomfortable day to do this awful and uncomfortable work. Martin Savage has been down there all day, and he knows better than any of us here, certainly, how uncomfortable it has been for the recovery teams.
Well, that's right, Aaron. It has been very difficult for the recovery teams. It's been difficult for the people who've been doing the digging. A lot of the digging work had been done almost by hand, literally bucket load by bucket load, that is passed in a human chain. That is done because they say that there is so much smaller pieces of debris, dirt and papers and pieces of the building that are really too small to be handled, because what has happened is that they are trapped inside of steel girders, they're trapped inside of large chunks of concrete. So they cannot approach with the heavy equipment until this debris is pulled out of the way. The fact that it was raining so heavily made that work very difficult. At times it had to stop. The fact that it's dried out now means that the work can begin again. And we have been told that all of that material is sifted through, that the buckets are actually turned upside down and carefully gone through, looking for evidence, looking for remains. And then, of course, there was the threat of the wind. It has subsided somewhat, but still, those buildings that are still standing but damaged are very much a threat to the rescue crews. I was standing out here this morning, Aaron, staring. I find myself looking at it. You are fixated on that spot when you are here, even though the towers are gone. And a police officer sort of caught me deep in thought and said, it isn't going to change. It looks the same. And he's right, it is going to change. And I found that it was something inside of me, and maybe in a lot of people. That's what's changed.
Well, it may not change, but our impressions, how we feel about it, tends to change as we stare at these things. There was, we saw a painful, I think maybe is the right word, account of the other day that the search teams, as they go in, are carrying essentially small dishes or plates, so that as they find remains, they can be taken to morgues and held, and ultimately DNA tests can be done. This is how, in many cases, people are going to be identified, so families can, when that becomes necessary, have funerals for their loved ones, say goodbye in ways more appropriate than this. Thousands of DNA tests are going to be done. There's still almost 5,000, 4,700 people that we know of who are reported missing. And it is, we also, there have been a number of accounts of people who have made cell phone calls out and helping rescue workers to locate them and get them out in the first hours. There hadn't been much of that, and no survivors have been found today. There's also an effort made to get cell phone calls in, that is to say, to call the cell phone numbers of people who were working in the building. The cell phone technology essentially would allow then the phone company to track where that cell phone is. It also, if the phone is still working, the ringing sound itself might help rescue workers identify where someone is buried, possibly still alive, possibly not, but would help them locate someone. There was a report I heard earlier today that rescue workers, some of the firemen thought they heard some pinging sound, someone maybe banging against something, and I haven't heard anything on that since. So what we know for certain is that so far today, no more survivors have come from the site at all, Marty.
You're right. When we talked to the rescuers that were coming out this morning, those that had worked the night shift, they said that they had not heard the typical sounds that had been heard days before. Yesterday, they were telling us of the cellular telephone calls that you were talking about. And they told us specifically what they knew about the individual. I'm not going to pass that along because it would only serve to give hope that may not really exist at this point to a family that waits. And then there were the tapping sounds, the knocking sounds that have been reported. And you know, it's a remarkable scene when you're down there at this search site, and there's literally hundreds, sometimes thousands of people at work at the same time. And there is a shout that goes out, quiet. And it's passed throughout the throng of the rescuers. And very quickly, that whole site becomes so silent, you could hear a pin drop quite literally. The engines are shut down. Everyone stands in place, almost holding their breath and listening, along with that person who thought they heard something, and above all, hoping. Time goes by, and then it all begins again. Aaron?
Richard Roth is down on the streets as well, as Richard has been, as Martin Savage has been down there for the last several days. Richard?
Yes, Aaron, I kind of struck by something maybe with a political touch that doesn't really seem that pertinent now, but and it seems almost meaningless, but for months there was so much talk in New York City. When would the new President Bush visit this city? There had been more of a Democratic turnout here. It was now Senator Hillary Clinton. It all seems so ridiculous now. Who would have thought months back ago that this is how President Bush would return to the city? He'd already been here once before, maybe a second time, but brief visits. But it's incomprehensible that anyone could think about that's how George Bush would come to a city which is needed of a morale boost. And they're going to get one today by the visit by the president.
Judy?
Aaron, again, as we keep an eye on the president, what the president is seeing there in New York City, we are constantly watching the developments in the investigative front, and I can tell you that our national security producer, Chris Plant, is reporting that the Defense Department's investigating the possibility, as hard as this is to believe, that 2 of the alleged terrorists involved in what happened on Tuesday may have attended schools run by the U.S. military. Now, this is according to a senior defense official. This official didn't reveal the names in question, so we don't know whom he's talking about or other specifics, such as what kinds of schools they may have attended. But the official said 2 of the names released on Friday by the Justice Department, matching the names of people who had attended schools or courses sponsored by the U.S. military under a foreign military exchange program. Now, I should say that officials at the Pentagon are cautioning it's possible that these matching names are merely a coincidence, or that the terrorists were using false identities. And of course, we've been pointing that out on CNN all day long, that they may have taken on the identities of other people. Pentagon officials also wanting us to know that military officers from many countries around the world attend these U.S. military academies or courses every year. So this is done all the time, but what irony it would be if it turned out that one of these terrorists had been to school at a U.S. military-sponsored course. You're watching now in New York, streets of Lower Manhattan, a motorcade with the President of the United States.
See some people on the sidewalks there, don't know if those are civilians or firefighters, rescue workers, as the motorcade makes its way through the city.
Aaron, can you tell us, do we assume traffic has been completely, maybe,
Well,
maybe you've already answered this question.
Yeah, well, as you know, because of your years at the White House, whenever the president moves, essentially traffic around the president shuts down. If you're on a freeway, they shut down all the exits along the way. And in fact, the other day I heard former Vice President Gore make a remark about that as he talked about his new civilian life. There isn't much traffic down on Lower Manhattan. These days, it's all pretty much cordoned off anyway. And clearly nothing is moving very nearly around the president at all. The president is, we believe, in one of the Suburbans, large SUVs that always accompany these motorcades, usually filled with Secret Service agents, sometimes medical personnel, all part of the formal movement process of a president of the United States. And these things are kind of large and unwieldy, as you can imagine, and particularly down in that part of Manhattan where the streets get a bit narrow and tight as they'll move through here. And it has stopped, and we can't tell you why it has stopped. We just don't know.
Much longer motorcade than the typical one the president would be traveling in.
It seemed that way to me. That there were considerably more cars in the motorcade than you would normally see. And we assume that there are a fair number of New York City, New York State officials, FEMA officials, and the like. But as you can see, that's the back end of it, and it's still going. The white cars would be, almost certain, would be New York City police cars, would be part of the motorcade. We see a number of ambulances as well. So you would have New York City police, you would have Secret Service. Kelly, you most recently, I guess, of us been in these motorcades. Who else is in that long line, would you suspect?
Well, it's hard for me to see from the vantage point looking at the monitor here, but as you and Judy both noting, obviously a tremendously long motorcade. You have senior staffers and those traveling with the president. You have a whole slew of Secret Service officers there. You have, New York City Police Department and ambulances on hand, and more security measures than any of us really know. And as you know, Aaron, the U.S. Secret Service not talking about, and we certainly understand they never do, talking about the security measures that the Secret Service takes to make sure that the president is safe and sound. All we know is that the U.S. is really operating on a heightened state of alert, and that is expected to continue for an indefinite amount of time while there is still a concern about threats out there. So we just can't underscore the security situation. As we also noted yesterday, we saw it firsthand around the White House. We saw that the Secret Service decided to expand the security perimeter around the White House, basically closing off to pedestrian traffic several blocks around the White House, and also to any vehicular traffic as well. So they are taking every step they can take to make sure that the president and his top aides are safe and sound.
Part of what's so difficult right now for the administration, for the country in many ways, is that while the president wants to project a sense that things are okay, in fact things are something less than okay. This gathering at the National Cathedral today that Judy was at, most notably absent from that was the vice president. who we gather was kept away for security reasons. They didn't want the president and the vice president in the same location.
Absolutely, Aaron. The vice president remaining